I used to believe silence kept families together, that if I stayed calm, kept my head down, and swallowed what hurt, things would eventually smooth out. I believed that right up until the afternoon I walked into my father's garage and saw the shelf bare. The dust told the whole story before anyone opened their mouth. The medals were gone, not misplaced, not packed away, gone. And the words my father said next, spoken without looking up from his phone, would split my life clean in two. "Those fake medals of yours don't matter to anyone. Honor doesn't pay the bills." That was the moment silence stopped being peace and became surrender. The garage smelled the way it always had: oil, old paint, damp wood soaked with decades of rain. The concrete floor still held the dark outlines of where my father parked his truck every night. The pegboard on the far wall still carried the faint shadows of tools long gone. I had grown up here, learned how to hold a wrench here, learned how to keep my mouth shut here. I hadn't been back in nearly a year. Deployment schedules and training rotations had a way of shrinking distance into something abstract. But that weekend I'd come home to help clear space. My father had mentioned wanting to downsize, and I told myself it was easier to show up than to argue over the phone. I noticed the empty shelf immediately. It sat in the corner just above the old workbench, cleaner than the rest, a perfect rectangle where dust hadn't settled. That was where the metal box had lived. My box. The one I'd brought home years ago and placed carefully out of the way, not for display, not for praise, just for safekeeping. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the outline like it might fill itself back in if I waited. "Dad," I called, already knowing the answer. He was in the living room, TV volume turned up too high, a cable news anchor droning on about markets and gas prices. My father sat back in his recliner, one hand resting on his stomach, the other scrolling on his phone. He didn't look up when I asked about the box. "Oh," he said, casual as weather, "I sold it." The words didn't land right away. They hovered weightless. Sold what I asked? He finally glanced at me, irritation flickering across his face. The medals, they were just sitting there. I stepped closer, my boots echoing softly on the hardwood. "You sold my medals." He shrugged. "Nobody cares about those fake medals of yours anyway." Fake. I waited for the punchline that never came. "They're not fake," I said, keeping my voice steady. "They're issued, every one of them." He waved a hand, already done with the conversation. "Medal's metal, nobody's checking, and honor doesn't pay the bills." The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were loud, but because they were flat, final, like a door closing without a slam. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway, her hands twisting the edge of a dish towel. She didn't say anything. She didn't meet my eyes either. "Dad," I said slowly, "those aren't just keepsakes. Some of those items—" I needed the money, he cut in. "We needed it. Bills don't wait for ceremonies." That's when my brother spoke up from the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "You're overreacting," he said. "They're just objects." Dad did what he had to do. I looked around the room at the familiar furniture, the framed photos, the quiet lines of a family I thought I understood. Every face held the same expression, not guilt, not anger, just justification. I realized then that I was the only one standing on the other side of something invisible and immovable. I turned back toward the garage without another word. The rain had started while we were talking. Soft at first, then steadier, tapping against the tin roof in a slow, patient rhythm. I stood by the empty shelf again, the sound filling the space where the medals had been. Each one had a story. Long nights, long flights, names etched into memory that never made it home. And now their absence sat there like an accusation. Later in my childhood bedroom, I unpacked my bag. Everything I owned fit into 2 duffels. Military life trained you to carry only what mattered. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone resting in my palm, and searched online without really believing I'd find anything. It didn't take long. There they were. A blurry listing, bad lighting, my medals laid out on a scratched table like spare change. No context, no care. Just a price and a caption that read, "Military medal set. Vintage, sold as is." I scrolled through the photos, my hands going cold. One image showed a small scratch on the case lid, a mark I remembered making years ago when I dropped it in a hangar halfway across the world. I called my father. He answered on the second ring, already defensive. "I told you." "Take it down," I said. Silence stretched on the line. Why, he finally asked. It's already listed, someone will buy it. Those items aren't yours to sell. He exhaled sharply. You don't even live here anymore, you don't need them. That was the moment I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. Endurance wasn't love. It was surrender. I ended the call without raising my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I simply sat there in the dim light of a room that no longer felt like home and made a quiet promise to myself. I would not surrender again. Not to keep peace, not to protect comfort, not to save anyone from the consequences of their own choices. Outside, the rain kept falling, seeping into everything the way truths do when they're finally let in. I didn't sleep that night. Rain pressed against the window like a held breath, the streetlight outside flickering just enough to make shadows crawl across the walls of my childhood room. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle every creak, a reminder that I no longer fit inside it. Just after midnight I got up. The duffel bag I'd brought with me sat open on the floor. I reached past spare clothes and pulled out a slim folder wrapped in clear plastic. Inside were copies, digital printouts I kept updated every year the way some people keep insurance policies. Issue records, serial numbers, custody notes, boring paperwork to anyone else. To me it was proof. Each medal had a number, each number tied to a record, each record tied to a moment that didn't belong to my father, my family, or anyone scrolling through an online marketplace at midnight. I opened my laptop and started matching what I saw on the listing to what I had on file. The lighting was bad, but not bad enough. I zoomed in, heart-slowing focus sharpening. There it was, the Humanitarian Service Medal, third from the left, the tiny nick along the edge, the ribbon folded just slightly wrong the way I'd never bothered to fix. My stomach tightened. That one wasn't supposed to leave federal custody, not without paperwork, not without clearance. I closed the laptop and sat back, palms flat against the bed, grounding myself the way I'd been trained to do when panic threatened to take over. Breathe in, count, breathe out. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about my father anymore. It was about responsibility. At dawn, I left the house quietly. My mother was already awake, standing at the sink with her back to me, staring out at the gray morning like she was waiting for something to change on its own. I didn't say goodbye. Neither did she. The drive back to my apartment felt longer than it should have. The rain followed me the entire way, blurring the road until everything outside the windshield looked temporary. By the time I parked, my phone buzzed with messages. My brother, an aunt, a cousin I barely spoke to. Dad did what he had to do. Why are you making this a problem? Family comes first. I didn't reply. Inside my apartment, the quiet felt earned. I set my bag down, made coffee, and sat at the small table by the window. The city looked tired. So did I. I opened my laptop again and drafted a message not to the police, not to a lawyer, but to a contact listed deep in my unit's administrative directory. The kind of email most people never send unless they have to. Subject line: inquiry regarding improper sale of issued military honors. I kept it brief. Factual, no accusations, no names, just serial numbers, dates, and a simple question. What is the correct procedure when issued items appear in public resale? I hesitated before hitting send, my finger hovering over the trackpad. This was the point of no return. I thought of my father's voice, flat and certain. Honor doesn't pay the bills. I pressed send. The response came faster than I expected. An automated acknowledgement first, then an hour later a direct reply. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Please preserve all documentation. Further guidance to follow. I stared at the screen, feeling something shift. Not relief, not fear, just inevitability. That afternoon the listing disappeared. For a moment I allowed myself to hope. Maybe my father had listened. Maybe someone in the family had convinced him to take it down before things went further. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text appeared. Your father's furious. He says you're trying to ruin him. I closed my eyes and set the phone face down. By evening, the listing was back, reposted, this time with a lower price, as if urgency could outrun consequences. I called my father again. What are you doing? I asked, keeping my voice level. Selling, he snapped, before you make this any worse. You already have. He laughed sharp and humorless. You think some numbers on a piece of paper scare me? Nobody's coming. Nobody cares. I ended the call. That night I reviewed everything one more time. Screenshots, timestamps, messages. I organized them the way I'd been trained to organize reports, clean, chronological, unemotional. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. I wondered how many families had this same argument in different words, how many times honor got weighed against convenience and quietly lost. The next morning I woke to an email marked urgent. Case opened, preliminary review underway, do not contact seller directly. My chest tightened. I hadn't expected it to move that fast. By midday my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Missed calls stacked up, names repeating. My brother, my aunt, my mother again. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I sat at my desk, hands folded, and waited. Somewhere out there, someone was looking at the same numbers I was, reading the same records, connecting dots that couldn't be undone. For the first time since I'd walked into that garage, I felt strangely calm. Not because I knew how it would end, but because I knew I'd done the only thing left that was still mine to do. Outside, the clouds broke just enough for a thin strip of light to slip through. It landed on the table, catching the edge of my coffee mug, bright and brief. I watched it fade, already sensing the quiet before the impact. I didn't know who bought the medals. Not at first. All I knew was that somewhere beyond my screen, beyond my father's living room, and the quiet justifications of family, someone had clicked buy now without understanding what they were holding. It turned out that mattered. I learned later that the man lived 3 states away, a retired logistics officer with a habit of restoring old radios and collecting military insignia. He'd served long enough to recognize patterns most people never noticed. He'd spent years signing off on manifests, verifying custody chains, checking serials that everyone else skimmed past. When the package arrived, he didn't open it right away. That detail stayed with me. Instead, he turned the box over in his hands, noticing the weight, the way the seals had been taped and retaped, the casual carelessness of someone who didn't know or didn't care what they were shipping. He laid the medals out on his workbench under a bright lamp and began comparing them to his reference guides. One number stopped him cold. The same humanitarian service medal I'd stared at on my screen the night before. He checked it again and again. Then he did what I hadn't done, and what my father never expected anyone would do. He picked up the phone. I was in the middle of a briefing when my own phone began to vibrate across the table. Once, twice, then again. I ignored it at first, eyes on the slide deck, mind focused where it needed to be. By the time the meeting ended, I had 7 missed calls. 3 from my father, 4 from my mother. I stepped into the hallway and leaned against the cool wall, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I already knew something had shifted. The air felt different, heavier. I called my father back. He answered on the first ring-breath, ragged voice, sharp with panic. "They're here," he said, not even bothering with hello. "There are men outside the house. They're asking questions." I closed my eyes. "Who's they?" I asked, though I already knew. "The government," he snapped. "Some kind of investigators. They say it's about stolen property." I waited for him to finish shouting before I spoke. It took longer than I expected. "You did this," he said finally, his voice breaking. "You brought this on us." "No," I said quietly, "I didn't." There was a pause, long enough for him to hear the certainty in my tone. "You sold something that wasn't yours to sell," I continued, "and someone noticed." "You could have stopped it," he said. "You could have handled it privately." "I tried," I said. "You didn't listen." The line went dead. A moment later, my phone buzzed again, not a call this time, but an email. Official, precise. Every word weighed and measured. Formal statement requested from original recipient. Immediate cooperation required. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the reality settle into place. Outside, the day had turned gray again. A fine mist drifted across the parking lot, softening the edges of the world. I stood there longer than I should have, phone still in my hand, watching people pass without noticing me. By evening, the videos started coming in. A neighbor had recorded from across the street. The angle was bad, the image shaky, but the content was unmistakable. 2 federal agents stood at my father's front door badges, catching the light as they spoke. My mother hovered in the background, hands clasped at her chest. Another clip followed. The agents stepping aside. My father's face, pale mouth moving faster than his hands. A third clip showed them carrying boxes out, documents, electronics, the kind of items people forget are evidence until someone takes them away. I watched without sound. My phone rang again and again, numbers piling up, messages stacking unread. My mother left voicemails this time, crying, pleading, asking me to explain what was happening as if I could undo it by choosing the right words. I didn't return any of the calls. That night I sat alone at my kitchen table, a single lamp casting a circle of light around me. I replayed the last conversation I'd had with my father in my head, the way his certainty had cracked the moment consequences showed up uninvited. For years I'd believed keeping the peace meant absorbing damage quietly, letting things slide, not forcing people to face what they'd done. Now I wondered how many lines had been crossed because no one ever said stop. Near midnight another email arrived, this one shorter. Please be available for further contact within the next 48 hours. I closed the laptop and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. Somewhere out there, a man I'd never met had looked at a set of medals and recognized what they represented. He hadn't known my name, he hadn't known my family, but he'd known enough to do the right thing. That mattered more than I could explain. I stood and walked to the window. The city lights blurred against the rain, red and white reflections sliding down the glass like slow-moving tears. For the first time since all of this began, I felt the weight of what was coming. Not fear exactly, but consequence rolling forward with its own momentum. My phone buzzed once more. A text from my mother. Please, just answer. Your father doesn't understand what he's done. I set the phone down and let it vibrate itself silent. Understanding, I'd learned, doesn't come before consequence. It comes after. And sometimes not at all. The first call came before sunrise. I was already awake, sitting at the small table by the window with a mug of coffee I hadn't touched. Outside, the city was wrapped in that pale gray light that made everything look unfinished. My phone buzzed once, then went still. I didn't look at it. The second call followed a minute later, then a third. By the time I finally turned the phone face up, there were 9 missed calls, all from my mother. I knew what she would say before I heard her voice, that my father was scared, that things had gone too far, that families weren't supposed to handle problems like this, that I needed to come home and fix it. Fix it. I'd been hearing that word my whole life. By mid-morning, the number climbed to 20. I was sitting in a quiet office, the kind of room designed to make people speak carefully. Across from me sat a man in a plain suit, his posture straight, his expression neutral. He asked questions the way professionals do, slowly, clearly, without emotion. Dates, locations, serial numbers, how long the items had been stored at my father's house. I answered every question. I didn't volunteer more than what was asked. I didn't editorialize. I didn't defend myself. When we finished, he closed his folder and nodded once. Thank you for your cooperation. Outside the building, my phone buzzed again. 35 missed calls. All from my mother. I stood there staring at the screen, feeling the weight of each unanswered ring. Every call represented a choice she hoped I would make. Every vibration was an invitation to step back into a role I had finally outgrown. I slipped the phone into my pocket and started walking. That afternoon, the story escaped the confines of our family. A neighbor's video made its way into local feeds. Nothing dramatic, just flashing lights, official vehicles, the front of my father's house framed by wet pavement. People recognized the street, recognized the place. Speculation filled the gaps facts hadn't reached yet. By evening, my brother posted something vague but pointed. Some people care more about rules than blood. I read it once and closed the app. The calls kept coming. I imagined my mother pacing the kitchen, phone in hand, replaying memories like evidence, school plays, scraped knees, the way I used to run home when thunder scared me. I imagined her thinking that if she just tried hard enough, she could pull me back into that version of myself. But that girl had learned how to follow orders in places where mistakes cost lives. She'd learned that accountability didn't disappear just because someone you loved asked nicely. Late that night, a message came through from an unknown number. No name, just words. They searched the house, took computers. Dad's furious. He keeps saying you betrayed him. I stared at the message for a long time. Betrayal, that was the word everyone kept circling. No one asked what it felt like to see my service reduced to a price tag. No one questioned the betrayal of trust that came with selling something that had never belonged to them. Betrayal apparently only flowed one way. I typed a reply, then deleted it. Silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was boundary. The next morning I woke to a voicemail I couldn't ignore. It wasn't crying this time. It was flat, controlled. My mother's voice stripped of emotion. They said they might press charges, she said. Your father can't handle that. He's not well. If something happens to him, I don't know how you'll live with yourself. The message ended there. I sat on the edge of my bed phone, heavy in my hand. For a moment, doubt crept in the old reflex to step in front of consequences meant for someone else, to absorb the damage and call it love. I took a slow breath. Then another. I set the phone down. That afternoon, my commanding officer called me into her office. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply laid out the reality. While this is under review, she said, you'll be placed on administrative hold. I nodded. I understand. As I left the building, I realized how quiet everything felt. No calls, no messages, just the steady hum of traffic and the soft weight of rain starting up again. That night I dreamed of the garage. The empty shelf, the clean rectangle of dust, the echo of my father's voice telling me none of it mattered. I woke with a start heart racing the room, dark and unfamiliar. It took a moment to remember where I was, to remember that some lines once crossed didn't lead back to comfort. By dawn, I knew there was no going back, not to the version of my family that relied on my silence, and not to the belief that peace could be bought by swallowing the truth. I checked my phone one last time. 35 missed calls. I turned it off. The call came just after dusk. I was standing in my kitchen rinsing a mug I hadn't finished when my phone lit up again. This time it wasn't my mother's number. It was the local hospital near my father's house. I answered before the second ring ended. Your father collapsed this afternoon, the nurse said, her voice practiced and calm. It appears to be a minor stroke. He's stable, but we'd like immediate family here. Immediate family. The phrase settled into me like a weight I'd been carrying my whole life. I drove through the night rain, blurring the highway into long silver streaks. Every mile felt heavier than the last. I replayed my father's words in my head. Fake medals, honor doesn't pay the bills, as if repeating them might somehow dull their edge. It didn't. The hospital smelled the way they all do, antiseptic coffee that had burned hours ago and something faintly metallic underneath it all. The lights were too bright, the hallways too clean. It felt like a place where truths came out because there was nowhere left to hide them. My mother was waiting in the corridor, her shoulders slumped, her eyes red but dry. When she saw me, relief flickered across her face, followed immediately by something harder. You came, she said, like she hadn't been sure I would. I came, I replied. She didn't hug me. Instead, she turned and walked toward my father's room, expecting me to follow. I did. He looked smaller in the hospital bed. The man who used to fill doorways now seemed folded into the sheets, one side of his face, slack with exhaustion. Machines beeped softly beside him, measuring time in steady intervals. My brother stood near the window, arms crossed. He didn't look at me. When my father opened his eyes, they went straight to mine. There was anger there, and something else. Fear, maybe, or pride struggling to hold its ground. So he said hoarsely, "You got what you wanted." I felt my chest tighten, but my voice stayed even. "That's not what this is." He scoffed. "They took my computers, asked me questions like I'm a criminal." "They asked because they had to," I said. "You didn't have to push it this far," he snapped. "You could have told them it was a misunderstanding." I stepped closer to the bed, keeping my hands at my sides. It wasn't a misunderstanding. My mother's breath caught. "Please," she said, "not now." But it was already now. "You taught me rules," I said to my father. "You taught me that if you take something that isn't yours, there are consequences." His jaw clenched. "Those rules were for strangers, not family." "That's where you were wrong," I replied quietly. The monitor beeped faster for a moment. A nurse glanced in, then moved on. My father turned his head away from me, staring at the wall. "If you go any further with this," he said, voice low, "don't come back." I can't look at you knowing what you did to us." The words landed exactly where he intended them to. I didn't answer right away. I watched his reflection in the darkened TV screen across the room, watched my own face appear beside his, older than I remembered, steadier than I felt. "You say I chose rules over family," I said finally, "but you chose money over what those medals meant." "They were just metal," he muttered. "They were custody," I said. "They were memory, and they weren't yours." My brother pushed off the wall, then stepping between us. "Enough," he said. "Look at him. You're killing him." I met my brother's eyes. "No," I said. "What's killing him is pretending none of this mattered." Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. The machines kept their rhythm indifferent. My mother began to cry, then quiet and controlled the way she always had. "Can't you just tell them to stop?" she asked me. "Say you overreacted. Say you didn't mean it." I shook my head slowly. "I can't." "Why?" she whispered. "Because if I did, I would erase myself." I didn't say that. I didn't have to. "I'm not asking for punishment," I said instead. "I'm asking for accountability." My father laughed softly, a broken sound. "You sound just like them." "Maybe," I said, "but those rules are the only thing that kept me alive out there." He closed his eyes. The nurse returned a few minutes later, gently reminding us visiting hours were almost over. My mother squeezed my arm as if trying to hold me in place. "Stay," she said. I looked at my father one last time. He didn't open his eyes. "I'll be nearby," I said, "if you want to talk." He didn't answer. I left the room and walked back into the hallway, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up. I pressed my palms together, grounding myself the way I'd learned to do years ago. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist. The parking lot glistened under the streetlights. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cool air, feeling the ache settle deep in my chest. I hadn't come to win. I hadn't come to punish. I'd come to stand where I'd been standing all along, on the side of what was right, even when it cost me everything else. As I drove away, the hospital lights faded in my rearview mirror, replaced by darkness and the long stretch of road ahead. For the first time, I didn't feel like turning back. Washington, D.C. never pretends to be warm. The buildings rise straight and sharp, glass and stone, reflecting a version of you that feels smaller than the one you brought with you. Everything moves with purpose, even the silence. Especially the silence. I arrived before dawn, the city still half asleep. My reflection stretched thin across the polished floors of a government annex that smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. A badge was printed for me. Temporary, neutral, no emotion attached. I sat in a waiting area beneath a clock that ticked loudly enough to make every second feel counted. Across the table, a man flipped through my file with the practiced calm of someone who had seen hundreds of stories like mine. His suit was unremarkable, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, his eyes held neither sympathy nor judgment. "Thank you for coming in," he said. "This won't take as long as you think." It always did. He asked me to walk him through the timeline. I did. The garage, the empty shelf, the listing, the calls, the hospital. I spoke the way I had been trained, clearly, precisely, without embellishment. When I finished, he nodded once and closed the folder. "You understand," he said, "that this is not about family." "I do," I replied. "It's about custody," he continued, "and precedent." That word stayed with me. Precedent. In another room later that morning, I learned how wide the problem really was. Charts on screens, numbers climbing quietly, cases flagged across states, medals sold in estate sales, items pawned after funerals, honors passed down, then passed along again, stripped of context and protection. "You're not alone," a woman in uniform told me, tapping the screen. "You're just early." That afternoon, my phone buzzed with messages I didn't open. My mother, my brother, distant relatives suddenly close enough to have opinions. I let them wait. Instead, I stayed late, answering follow-up questions, clarifying details, signing statements. Somewhere between the third cup of coffee and the fourth form, something shifted. The ache in my chest dulled, replaced by focus. This wasn't just about what I'd lost. It was about what could be protected. By the end of the week, I was asked a question I hadn't expected. "Would you consider consulting the man from earlier?" asked. "Short term. We need perspective from someone who understands both sides of this." I thought of my father's voice in the hospital room. The way he'd said rules weren't meant for family. I thought of the buyer who'd known better, of the shelf in the garage. Yes, I said. The work was quieter than I imagined. No speeches, no headlines, just long hours tracing records, identifying gaps, drafting recommendations that would never carry my name. I learned how often silence hid negligence, and how easily honor slipped through cracks no one bothered to seal. At night, back in the small apartment I'd rented, I stared at the empty space above my desk where a box used to sit. I'd brought it with me from home, empty now, lighter than it had any right to be. One evening, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. No subject line, just a sentence in the body. Don't let them make you feel guilty for doing the right thing. Integrity still matters. I read it twice. I never replied. News from home came in fragments. My father had been released. He wasn't speaking much. My mother said he spent hours sitting in the garage staring at the workbench. My brother blamed me. My aunt stopped calling altogether. I let the distance grow. Because sometimes space was the only way to keep something from breaking completely. On my last day in the building, I stood in front of a glass wall overlooking the city. The sun was setting, turning the monuments gold for a few quiet minutes before night reclaimed them. I pressed my palm against the cool surface and breathed. I hadn't found peace, but I had found purpose. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Time doesn't rush forgiveness. It doesn't chase it down or demand it show up on schedule. Time waits, patient and indifferent, letting consequences settle where they fall. By the time winter reached Washington, I understood that better than I ever had. Snow softened the city in a way rain never could. It muted the edges, quieted the streets, made everything look almost gentle. From my office window, I watched it collect on ledges and railings, white layers building slowly, honestly. No shortcuts, no disguises. The program had a name now, a budget, a mandate. Lost Honors Recovery. It sounded clinical, necessary, it was. Everyday files crossed my desk, families who'd sold medals without knowing the laws, children cleaning out attics, widows pawning boxes they didn't recognize. Some cases ended with education, others with penalties, a few with quiet apologies sent to people who would never read them. I didn't take satisfaction in any of it. But I took responsibility. My father didn't call. Not at first. Weeks passed, then months. My mother sent occasional updates, short messages about weather appointments, nothing that required a response. I replied when I could, carefully without reopening wounds that were still raw. One afternoon, a plain envelope arrived at my office. No return address. Inside was a single postcard, edges worn, ink slightly smudged. I saw your name mentioned, it read. You did good. I'm proud even if I can't say it out loud. I held the card longer than necessary. That was how my father apologized. Sideways, in fragments, the way he'd taught me to fix engines without talking about what was broken. I didn't write back. Not because I didn't want to, but because some bridges needed time before weight could be tested again. Spring came quietly. The city thawed. Work continued. The empty metal box stayed on the shelf above my desk, a red evidence tag still looped through its latch. I kept it there on purpose. Accountability isn't paperwork. It's character. The hearing happened on a Tuesday. Bright lights, cameras, a room full of people who'd never met me but had opinions anyway. I spoke plainly, answered directly. When asked if I regretted reporting the sale, I didn't hesitate. If I'd stayed silent, I said I would have betrayed everyone who earned their honors the right way. There were no gasps, no applause. Just a quiet nod from the chair before the next question moved on. Outside the building, reporters waited. I walked past them without stopping, my reflection briefly flashing across their lenses before disappearing. That night, my phone buzzed with messages I didn't read. Support, criticism, strangers arguing about a life they only knew in headlines. I turned the phone face down and poured a cup of coffee, watching steam rise in the dim kitchen light. Later, as I stood by the window, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed keeping quiet kept families together. The one who mistook endurance for love. I understood now what she couldn't. Silence has a cost. And someone always pays it. A year passed. On a quiet Sunday morning, I visited Arlington. Snow had returned light and clean, settling over the rows of markers like a promise kept. I stood there without ceremony, hands in my coat pockets, breathing in the stillness. "I forgive you," I said softly, not to any one person, but to the version of myself that had carried the weight longest. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences, but it does release you from them. When I left, the wind stirred the flag's fabric, snapping once before settling again. Strong, steady. That night I called my mother. We didn't talk about medals, or investigations, or the garage. We talked about ordinary things: weather, a neighbor's new dog, the way the house sounded now that it was quieter. Before hanging up, she hesitated. "Your father asks about you," she said. "That's enough," I replied. Because it was. If you've stayed with me this far, maybe something in this story touched you. Maybe you recognized a moment where silence felt safer than truth, or a choice where doing the right thing meant standing alone. If that's you, you're not alone. I want to know where you're listening from. Share your thoughts in the comments below. These stories exist to remind us that integrity still matters, and that even when it costs us, it's worth holding on to. We have many more stories like this to share with you. If you'd like to continue this journey together, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying.